non-negotiables. And so I was prepared for them to just be like, you know, goodbye, go on, we're good. But my non-negotiables, in addition to creative autonomy, was this story has to be told through the point of view of me and her story. Also, I was not willing to show any physical violence inflicted on Black bodies. And the third one was that we were going to begin and end in a space of joy, and that this was also going to be a love story between Mamie and her son, and the physical trauma that was inflicted upon Emmett was not going to be the focal point of the story. And so the producers kept saying, okay, yeah, we want you to go in the direction you believe the story needs to go in, because we believe in your artistry. And that was Barbara and Whoopi, who were just so adamant about that. And to get that kind of confidence and to have that kind of creative freedom as an artist in general, but especially a Black female artist, is just rare. You know, and I said, okay, I got to sign up for this.
So I want to talk about that, just to hang out there a little bit more. So, but what made you, since you didn't know that much about Mamie, but you were already sure sort of when you walked in the room, if they're going to keep talking to me about this film, I'm going to insist that it's going to be through the eyes of Mamie Teal Bradley. Was that in part a decision wrapped around the fact that we know of this story, even though we may not know intimate details? This story is so familiar in a sense, such that we don't even remember, how did I learn about Emmett Till? Was it school? Was it a history book? Did grandma tell me about Emmett Till? Was that in part a decision about how to sort of take a sort of narrative ownership of this story that is known so well? Did that play into thinking about, what could I do with this story that is so well known that on screen would sort of give it this kind of narrative pathway? Because sometimes we know the story, quote, so well, so to speak, historically.
We know what happened to Emmett, but I don't think a lot of us know really the story of this incredible journey. And so I thought, you know, the world, you and I, us in the room, we know who Emmett Till was because of Mamie. And so she is the heartbeat, the foundation of this story. And so that is one of the biggest reasons why I knew that I needed to tell the story through her lens, through her point of view, because she's the core of it, you know. Also, you know, it was an opportunity for me to center a Black woman. And Black women are so often erased in history and our present, and especially when we talk about civil rights movements, Black women are critical. Like we're essential, but we get written out so often and erased, you know. And oftentimes when films explore civil rights movements or freedom movements, Black women are not centered. So I thought this would be a really great opportunity to rightfully center this incredible person who's a Black woman.
I love that. I feel like the fall is sort of a gift. I was saying to the audience before the film that this is a really interesting fall to see Black female directors take center stage. I'm like, is this fantasy land? I do not want it to end. But I want to take further another point, and I was reading your comments about this and you just mentioned it. And that is about joy.
Yeah.
And how you wanted this film to, in some ways, begin with joy. You're going to take us through the pain, but that it was to end with joy. And I was really fascinated by that comment and how you sort of navigated, right? Between joy and pain, and then joy again. So talk about your decision and your thinking around depicting the joy and the pain and the joy in a story such as this.
Well, I truly believe in my personal philosophy in life as a Black woman in this world is that my joy is my greatest form of resistance, or one of my greatest forms of resistance. And so alongside the inherent pain, frustration, anger, and trauma of being a Black woman in this world, I am very intentional about my life being rooted in joy and peace and community and love. And so, and I thought of that when I was writing the script, when I was directing the film, that, you know, the reality is that there was a lot of love and community and moments of joy in Mamie's life and in the lives of all the people that were portrayed in this film, alongside the inherent pain and sadness of the story. So it was really important for me to show that, because I think that can also show some hope some possibility, some empowerment, you know, especially as Black people, we are not solely defined by the pain and trauma that can come in being our body, that can come with being Black in this world. And so it was really critical for me to show audiences, particularly Black audiences, that there's more beyond that, you know. Another thing is that, you know, the physical violence is not critical to telling this story, you know, and that's why I spent about 30 minutes of the film focusing on like having Emmett be alive and living and showing the interactions he had with Mamie, because that's the lasting memory I wanted people to have more so than his corpse.
I love that decision, and I love the way that you had that shot, particularly when you do the extreme close-ups at the train station, and you really emphasize that this is Mamie's story. We already know it is, but I love that you were very intentional there to really emphasize her eyes and go with the extreme close-ups in that scenario, and then take us to the casket, but we're still very much through her perspective. And in the coroner's office. Whew, right? Which is when we first see through her eyes her son. Talk about was there a sort of decision-making process that you had to go through in directing this with what to show when? So for example, did you go in going, I'm not gonna show that murder, so to speak, sound enough, we know, right? But it is important to show his body here. So, because you could have shown that simply through the funeral, but you chose the moment in the coroner's office. So I'm just wondering if you could sort of give us a little insight into how you made decisions about sort of when to show you. You do such wonderful blocking. We don't see that body until it's in them. I just want to know more about your process for making these really difficult, but such key direction there.
Yeah. Well, if we're thinking about the scene where Mamie sees Emmett's body, the beginning of that shot, we're probably spend about a minute just focusing on Mamie and Jeannie, without seeing the body, right? It's obstructed, you know, based on how the shot is composed. And so we're just with Mamie's emotional moment, and we don't see his face in that scene. It's just abstractions of his body and then juxtaposed with close-ups of Mamie's face, so we can be in her emotional experience looking at his body as much as possible. And it's when we see his face with the people who view his body. And so my decisions, what informed those decisions for me was I knew that when we do show his face, it has to be earned and it needs to be sparing, right? Like that, the way that it can have the most impact is to withhold it as much as possible. But I knew that showing his body was going to be important because that's an extension of the decision that Mamie made. And so I am honoring that decision that she made by showing his body. But I knew that I didn't want to be gratuitous with it, and it needed to be just one time in that long shot where we zoom out is enough, you know, and I think it makes it that much more effective, you know, and that was something that I really learned through the making of my last film, Clemency, the power of restraint, you know, and
Say it again.
the power of restraint. Listen, I was a film professor for 10 years, so I know what you're doing. I know what you're doing. I know what you're doing.
Exactly.
Power of restraint. You show, don't tell. Something I always told my students as well, where there's no conflict, there's no story.
Keep going.
All the
You're teaching class.
listen, don't make me bring the PowerPoint. I still have my PowerPoint from when I'm talking. I'll send it to you. I'll send it to you.
You're going to help me.
Absolutely. So the power of restraint, you know, and sometimes what's the most horrific thing, or what gets your point across about communicating the different emotions is, you know, in the case of Clemency, there's a moment near the end of that film where we hold on the prison warden as she's watching as a man is being
played by Alfred Woodard the Great.
Who is phenomenal.
Phenomenal.
And we stay on her face for 2.5 minutes as this execution is happening in front of her. But witnessing her emotional anguish as that executing is happening, we are able to emotionally experience that execution through her gaze, right, by holding onto her face. We don't have to show the actual physical execution to communicate the horror, right, to communicate the trauma of that. And so I really incorporated that lesson I learned.
And learn to trust it. Learn to trust it. We will hang with you.
You will hang
patiently.
And by withhold, it's probably a good 30 minutes from the moment Emmett is abducted to when we see his body. And that absence really makes us, when we see the body, that much more pronounced. And also, it makes your mind go to, what must they have done to this boy? And I really do think that was also part of the horror when Mamie decided for the world to see what happened to her son, because I think a lot of people's minds were like, what must have happened? Because he was unrecognizable, and so all of that informed my decisions.
So talk about directing this in terms of the actors, and you're working with a young actor playing Emmett Till and other children on the set. And I always wonder, as the director, how you sort of guide, but this is a difficult one for adults. Imagine, we're watching it. Imagine the actors, right, shooting specific scenes, and then you have children. So can you give us a little bit of insight about how you navigate it and how you navigate that on set?
Well, it's a couple things. I mean, in terms of concrete directing tips, I learned to keep it simple with children. Don't try to give them a bunch of directions all at once and that are really heady, and keep it simple, keep it brief, and give one directing note at a time. Because they're not going to be able to remember everything, and they're gonna always say, yeah, I got it. They don't want to disappoint. They don't want to. Keep it simple, and that was for all of the kids. But but I also had an on-set therapist, and who provided support for all the cast and all the crew, and the parents of all the children were on set every single day, which was critical. I mean, during the abduction scene, Jalen needed to take a break and and he asked for a hug from his mom. And I was like, we gotta drop everything. He needs to have a hug from his mom, and we don't resume until he's ready. And it's just that simple. There's just certain scenes, like when Mamie is examining Emmett's body and she releases this sob. I was like, guys, I told the crew, we got 2 takes. I'm not gonna have her go through that for more than 2 takes. So y'all figure out what y'all need to do to make sure the lighting and all the technical stuff is right and excellent, because perfect or not, that's it. And I was also very communicative with all the actors and the crew about where they're at emotionally and psychologically. I'm very protective of the people that I work with, and I just want to make sure everybody is good. So constantly checking in, having parents on set, having an on-set therapist, only having only a certain amount of takes for each scene, and being clear, specific, and focused in my directing to them. And also, I'm overly communicative to the actors that I work with, particularly when it's very
no such thing.
Right, exactly. When we're shooting particularly emotionally challenging scenes, I'll let them know, listen, I got you, 2 takes, we're good, or the scene where Mamie is looking at Emmett's body. I had a conversation with Danielle in pre-production. When in the shooting schedule would you want us to shoot that? I had conversation with Jalen and his mom. When in the shooting schedule do you feel like you would be ready to shoot this or shoot that? And extra conversations with his mom when we were ready to shoot those scenes, like the abduction scene, about, okay, make sure that you are this close to set as opposed to being that far away. I need you right here, at the monitor, because I have, in case he needs your support, So all of those things really helped.
I love that. I want to ask you. I'm so glad I asked you that, because you wonder sometimes. It's mysterious to those of us who, out here. I'm a filmmaker as well, but I do understand that when I'm watching a movie, it's still mysterious to me in terms of what goes on set.
Yeah.
with particular scenes, and it's always really interesting to find out from the director or the cast, sort of take us into how you're navigating this extremely emotional text.
Yeah.
You know? I want to ask you too, did you have concern, because the story is so, it's well known, but it's not well known.
Yeah.
It's like you know the name Emmett Till.
Yeah.
And there are museums, you know, there's the museum in DC, there are, you know, places where there are actual artifacts that deal with, obviously, this history. But it does seem like the time has come, you know, that this happens with stories, right? They are submerged for so long. No one's treating it in documentary form, certainly no one's trying to make a narrative form, and then all of a sudden it seems that the times catch up, if you will, and this story is being told. So did you have that in mind? Because I always wonder if there are several projects going on at once. There's a documentary, someone else is doing the television one, someone's doing the film. Are you as the director thinking about all that? Because once a decision is made, you know, someone else could decide to do the project, and there may be 3 or 4 projects, and it seems like, wow, why is everyone doing a story on Emmett Till? When in fact, people have arrived at the decision at different points, and then the production, depending on what it is, they come out at different times. But how did that enter into it? Does it feel like the time had come for this story to you too, like the moment has caught up with it, or?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely feels to me that, I mean, this story needed, the producers have been trying to make this film for almost 20 years, you know, and so there were a lot of times when this film would have been incredibly timely, you know, and not just now, but definitely, especially now, you know, not just what's in the news, but the history keeps on repeating itself, but especially, you know, there's some states here in this country that are actively erasing this history from curriculum, you know, and so
Films may be our only reprieve.
Exactly, and to let people know about themselves, about our present, about our history, it's actively being erased.
You won't be able to teach it.
You won't be able to teach it, you know, and so that's one of the many reasons why it makes this story so necessary.
I love that. So one more thing, and then we're going to ask a couple folks if they might want to comment, ask you a question. 2 little tiny things. One is, there is a quote that I was reading maybe late last night, and I want to read it back to you because I want to get your insight, because this was maybe 3 years ago or so, and I want to know how you feel about it.
Something I said?
Something you said. Oh yes. I had to do the research. And
Snap, I love it.
Here we
You're
go.
a professor.
Yes, indeed. So, I couldn't be up here with a professor.
I love this.
So in 2019, after that, another noticeable moment where there was a lack of Black nominees, the Golden Globes, and during the award season, you said, quote, "We just have a long way to go. People need to create space, give space, make space for other voices to be in positions of power. And we have to support films that don't get recognized by white-centered patriarchal institutions," end quote.
I agree.
And do you feel that 3 years, almost 4 years removed from that, are you seeing progress? Are we further down the road to dismantling, perhaps, any of that lack of representation? She's about to keep it real, I can tell by her stance.
As y'all have your cell phones out recording them.
About to keep it real.
You know, progress is a complicated thing, right? Because, on one hand, there are stories being told now that wouldn't have gotten made even several years ago. And the systems of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy are still very much alive and thriving, right? So both can be true. And so, and also exceptions who've been able to get through these systems does not mean that progress overall has been made, and you know, my experience making Till was so unique in that I had such incredible creative autonomy. This is my first studio film, and so before making this film, I was talking to a lot of different directors I knew and respected who've been in the game for years and years and years and years, and I was like, all right, what do I gotta prepare myself for? And everyone was saying it's gonna be a horrible experience, because they've had horrible experiences, you know, and with studios, and this, that 6-minute, 45-second long take of Mamie's testimony, I knew someone from the studio was gonna snatch me up. Like, I was convinced I actually had to call someone at MGM, and it's like, all right, guys, this is what I did. And, you know, it's cool. And they were, yeah, it's amazing, it's incredible. And I had such a great team of support from Barbara, from Whoopi. The studio was incredible, and even just the way that they continue to support the film now as we're about to get ready for release, it's an incredible experience. And this is an experience that I wish for every director of color, especially, particularly women of color. And so I think that when we're looking at when we're asking the question, what does progress look like? For me, I think it has to mean not just about representation and hiring, but it's supporting that person in every sense of the word. It's setting them up to succeed. It is providing them with at least a reasonable budget and a reasonable amount of shooting days. It is, you know, it is having producers who are going to fight for you in a studio who believes in you. It's having the resources for good marketing, you know, and publicity. It means, you know, not gaslighting me. It means respecting my wishes. It means, you know, also hiring people, talented, exceptional people of color to crew, you know, and to be a part of every process of the making. And so I think that when we see a lot more of that, you know, that we could start talking more about progress. But I mean, there are definitely some changes that have been made, and there are things that have stayed the same.
Well, we still need to support films like Teal. Now,
Yes.
you may see it for free, so now I need you to go and take someone and pay to see the film and to do it on opening weekend, even.
Opening weekend. Yes, I mean, and that's critical too. It's like we gotta support, because you know the reality is that we need to continue to support. It's like when you support these films, you're supporting careers, you know, and you're supporting other voices who are important and that can help expand the narratives of people on screen. So,
And you're always dispelling that myth that Black-centered movies or so-called Black stories, A, aren't universal, and A, don't make money or not appealing in some way, and even though there are 1,000 white-centered films who are basically meaningless and are not making money, they will continue to be made, whereas it might dry out. You know, the spout might just really run dry. So thank you for that. Let's see if we have just a couple. We have time.